Our last presenter today is Julie Hollenbach. She's currently a doctoral student in the Department of Art here at Queen's University. Julie investigates the territory between art, craft, and digital practices, which is really interesting, as well as the complex roles of cultural institutions here, such as art museums, commercial galleries, auction houses, art fairs, biennials, and as we'll investigate today, heritage sites as well. Julie employs creative methodologies. She both practices art, is interested in theory and history. She has taught at both Queen's and NSCAD universities in craftivism and in contemporary art. Julie's paper is called Crossed Swords on Porcelain, Restoring the Home, Reimagining the Woman. Please join me in welcoming Julie.
Okay, thank you. Can you guys hear me okay far in the distance? Cool. If I drift off, let me know. Thank you all for staying so long. It's the last paper on the last afternoon. It's been a really delightful conference, and I'm really pleased to see you all. I'd like to start by acknowledging the invaluable assistance and kindness and insight of Ken Mathers, who's the longtime director, curator, and archivist at the historic O'Keefe Ranch in Vernon in British Columbia. Not only would this research project not have been possible without his generous and fastidious help, but the form that this research journey took would have been quite different. So I'll begin by saying that this paper is very much wrapped up in processes of story recovery and storytelling. This story, if it can be imagined as a plant, has many branches and blooms and continues to grow and expand beyond this moment, as all history does, really. This story is about two women. Three, actually. No, well, four women, though you could argue five. So while this narrative is about five women and their lives spanning the last 150 years, I position as a point of entry, as well as a pivotal storytelling object, a 19th century Meissen porcelain table service prominently displayed in pride of place at the historic O'Keefe Ranch. This is a story of backward glances, of imaginings, of reconstructing and retelling. So let's begin with our story. Let's set the scene. This is O'Keefe Ranch today, or well, in last December in the wintertime. Here are some photos of the ranch over the years. So this one was in 1887, a year after the ranch was constructed. It is the main mansion house built in the Queen Anne style, originally connected, which you can't really see here, to the log house that was the original structure that Cornelius O'Keefe lived in with his first wife, Mary Ann. This mansion was built in addition to it, and then the log house was turned into a kitchen. In 1896, the log house was detached and moved elsewhere on the property to make space for an addition at the back of the house that contained the dining room and the kitchen on the main floor, as well as 3 bedrooms and a washroom upstairs, and a full basement. The kitchen and dining area were extended in 1900, and gray stucco was added to the exterior in 1944, covering the original drop siding. This is a photo of the mansion around 1900. In 1967, the family opened the ranch to the public, and 10 years later, the Devonian Foundation of Calgary bought the ranch and donated the historic site to the city of Vernon. So these are just 2 pictures of the ranch day to day. So since 1967, the ranch has remained open to the public as an important historic heritage site and a popular tourist destination. These 2 interior shots show the general store, and this collection of confectionery as well as candy was something that was purchased in the 1960s to sort of put into the general store for the opening to display. As for the main characters in the story, the 5 women that I mentioned just a moment ago, it sort of hinges around this man, Cornelius O'Keefe, who was a cattle ranching tycoon and patriarch of the O'Keefe family. He and his partner, Thomas Greenhow, bought 160 acres of land at the northernmost tip of Okanagan Lake in 1867. Before settling, Cornelius and Thomas had made a modest fortune driving cattle up from Oregon to the gold fields of the Cariboo. During his life, Cornelius married 2 Irish-descendant Catholic women from Fallowfield, a small town just outside of Ottawa, where Cornelius himself was born and raised. Mary Ann McKenna married Cornelius in 1876 when she was 26 years old. This is a later photo of Mary Ann, as well as a photo of her and their youngest son, James. Together, they had 9 children. She died in 1899 at 49 years of age. A year later, Cornelius went back to Fallowfield in search of another bride, returning to the ranch with Elizabeth Tierney in 1900. At the time of their marriage, Elizabeth was just 23 years old, 40 years Cornelius' junior. Over the next 13 years, she and Cornelius had 6 children together. Their youngest son was Tierney O'Keefe, who, after Elizabeth's death in 1929, took over running the ranch. In 1945, Tierney married Betty Neve, and in the 1960s, the pair of them would, with the fervor that could only be mustered by true amateur enthusiasts, set about remaking the house as it used to be. So Betty is the one in the middle, dressed in the smart pant lady skirt suit. And Tierney is not the man in the dark suit, but the cowboy suit on the other side. Okay. So that puts us at 3 women, Mary Ann, Elizabeth, and then their daughter-in-law, Betty. However, before Mary Ann and before Elizabeth, there was Alapetsa, an Okanagan woman from the nearby village at Head Lake, who Cornelius took as his common-law wife in 1870. Alapetsa and Cornelius had 2 children. While it was common practice in the 19th century frontier for poor white settlers to take an indigenous woman as common-law wife, it was equally common practice for those wives and their children to be set aside should the settler do well enough for himself to support a white wife. This is what happened in this case. Cornelius's original 160 acres grew to 12,000 acres, and his cattle ranching enterprise prospered. O'Keefe Ranch was, in the 1870s, the only white settlement between Fort Kamloops and the Okanagan Mission, which is present-day Kelowna. With his burgeoning wealth, Cornelius wanted to expand the ranch. He wanted to build a bigger house, a bigger barn. He wanted to build a post office and a general store and a smithy. He wanted to build a church. And all this would require a wife, a mistress to run his household and have his children. But before I get too far ahead of myself, we should start at the beginning of the story, which is to say, let us start at the end with the 5th woman, me. In the summer of 2013, I was at home in Vernon, where I grew up. My mom had just had a major surgery, and I was her impatient and disgruntled, though dutiful and diligent nurse. When not nursing, I was elbow deep in a research project that focused on the development of white, hard-paste porcelain in Europe. First innovated in 1709 at the Royal Meissen Porcelain Manufactory just outside Dresden in Saxony. In the 18th century, with the recipe for white porcelain still very much a guarded secret, Meissen porcelain, with its gorgeous Rococo designs and embellishments, was treasured at a value greater than gold. However, for my project, I was specifically investigating the presence of Rococo Revival Meissen porcelain in the domestic interiors of the Victorian middle classes 100 years later. As I looked at printed, painted, and photographed representations of middle-class parlors and sitting rooms cluttered with knickknacks and ornaments, I found myself wondering, why would the Victorian bourgeois consumer have been drawn to mass-produced Rococo Revival porcelain when Baroque and Rococo styles were never broadly adopted in England a century prior, as those styles swept the rest of Europe? With Baroque and Rococo styles being so heavily tied to Catholicism and England, a Protestant nation. Furthermore, I wondered what made these Rococo Revival pieces attractive to Victorian middle-class consumers at a time when the market was so saturated with decorative articles, when fashion, self-portrayal, and class were inextricably linked, and when there was so much being written to instruct good taste. Why the Meissen Porcelain Rococo Revival pieces? To provide some context, Meissen porcelain was highly regarded as the very best and most beautiful and decorative objects in the 18th century. However, by the 19th century, Meissen had fallen onto hard times, pushed to the brink of closure more than once by wars and taxation. In In order to rally the manufacturing mechanized production, which resulted in lower quality of paste, simpler designs, and superficial paintwork. Simultaneously, many porcelain manufacturers across Europe had discovered the secret to white hard paste porcelain and were producing tablewares and ornamental sculptures that were more innovative in design and modeling, which were better painted and used richer glazes. But it struck me as so strange. From the 1820s onwards, there was this renewed interest in Mise en Rococo figurines, groups, and decorative pieces among English buyers, to the point where, by the 1830s, 1/3 of the factory's output consisted of what was referred to as English articles. Meissen was essentially producing cheap, hybridized knockoff versions of the beautiful Rococo pieces designed and modeled a century prior that had established the manufacturer's brand and reputation. Anyway, so in the midst of my caretaking duties and my Meissen porcelain conundrums, my then partner came to visit me for a week. And she was thoroughly bored by my daily routine that consisted of researching porcelain and bourgeois Victorian interior decorating trends and hanging out with my mom. So in an effort to show her how charming and fun Vernon can be, I decided to give her the full tourist treatment, which included spending an afternoon at O'Keefe Ranch. Now, I've been to O'Keefe Ranch as a child on field trips numerous times. I was there a few years ago for a wedding. It is a site I felt fairly familiar with. When we visited, these are just a few interior shots. This is the parlor, and this is a photograph of the parlor at what I estimate to be about 1920, based on the ages of the two daughters, Lily and Cora, from Cornelius's first wife, Marianne. This is Cornelius's library and sitting room. And if you look in the corner of the picture, you'll see a small chair poking out. And this is the Berlin work that would have been completed by his daughter Eileen. Yes, okay. So, but on this afternoon, as we were led through the main mansion house by a guide in period costume who recounted the familiar narrative of Cornelius's triumphant cattle ranching success and the brave pioneering wifery of Marianne and then Elizabeth O'Keefe, I was struck dumb by the presence of, I need water. Oof, getting so excited. It's making me hoarse. Struck dumb. Suspense. So I was struck dumb. By, lo and behold, a mid-19th century Meissen porcelain table service displayed prominently in the dining room and in the china cabinet. Was my brain exploding, I asked myself? Was the world slowly unwinding and suddenly everything revolved around Meissen porcelain? What was going on and what was it doing here? I began to entertain a fantasy of Marianne O'Keefe arriving at the ranch in the late 1870s, looking about, taking stock, and thinking to herself, this will not do. I will need a proper house and a proper tea service. As the guide on the tour told us in a whisper about Cornelius O'Keefe's real first common-law wife and how she was made to disappear, abandoned with 2 illegitimate children, I looked at the Meissen table service and thought, civility. What read as tacky kitchen in 1850s British interior, here read as the gesture of imperial allegiance and colonial expansion through the principles of domestic ordering and arrangement out in the wilds of the western frontier. After all, at the time, porcelain was commonly referred to as white gold. Tidy, I thought. Nice thesis. I smiled in anticipation, imagining the publication. Alas, not to be had. Answering the question of what the Meissen table service was doing out there in the sticks took me a 2-year journey. This is another beautiful piece that's part of the 144 item set. So it turns out neither Marianne nor Elizabeth bought the Meissen table service. Bummer. Instead, it was Betty O'Keefe in a specialty antique store on the south end of Granville Street in Vancouver in the mid-1960s. There is no record of how much she paid for the table service, though the story goes that Tierney hit the roof when he discovered how much, and that it is the single most expensive acquisition made for the ranch. The couple had decided that they would open the ranch to the public coinciding with Canada's centennial celebrations, and so leading up to 1967, they went about the work of reconstructing and imagining not only the real lived house of their parents and family as it had looked over 70 years before, but also the ideal romanticized version of a mansion house in the colonial wilds with all its rough richness and conspicuous luxury. Many things in the house were original, such as this chair, which is part of a 5-piece furniture set bought by Elizabeth in the first decade of the 20th century. Many things in the house were not. This was a chandelier bought by Betty and Tierney. It is made from Venetian glass. So this is again the sitting room. And this is one of the fire shields. And this is a chandelier that Tierney spent years collecting crystal pieces for and then constructing himself. Many things were bought by Betty and Tierney for their nostalgic Victoriana or for its connotations of luxury. Many things fit seamlessly with the narrative that they were trying to construct, such as the shield, and some things, such as the mice and porcelain table service, as well as this stairway, did not and disrupted the narrative. So this stairway is in the back in the sort of added-on kitchen. And this is marbleized, what Tierney thought would make it, really authentic. And, so what was once beautiful chestnut wood is now this. They, in the upstairs room, reconstructed or created scenes. So this would have been the nursery, and these are all sort of acquired objects, and the children's schoolroom. And then, interestingly, in 1965, Betty and Tierney and their children created photographs for a brochure where they restaged what life would have been like, which is charming. And so that's them buying things in the general store. Yeah. So while the table service in such good condition with so many pieces intact was a pricey sought-after antique in the 1960s, in the 1870s it would have been understood, even, I think, by country settlers such as the O'Keeffes, as cheap derivatives. The family, after all, owned a few pieces of late 19th century Wedgwood porcelain that were bought by either Marianne or Elizabeth, as they were in Elizabeth. What is that, the list when you die of objects? There, that's it. And these items would have been much in vogue at the time, suggesting that Marianne and Elizabeth, while from humble origins, took seriously the task of furnishing their beautiful house in a tasteful manner appropriate to their class aspirations and financial capabilities. Of course, very little written record of these women exists. Of Marianne, we have only photographs. Of Elizabeth, we have her written day books from 1925, 1927, and 1928, as well as a few photographs. As a widow, Elizabeth ran the ranch efficiently, completely on her own for 10 years. She kept meticulous records, and her day books are full of her daily accounting, but completely devoid of any revelatory musings that I, as a researcher, ached for. Anything that would give insight into her personality, insight into her intent, and material decisions. There was nothing like that. But throughout the house, we see these women represented. Marianne in the cutlery that sits on the dining room table. This cutlery set is silver and was given as a gift to her by Cornelius on the occasion of the birth of their second son. The 3-piece East Lake inspired bedroom furniture and the original woodworking for the mantelpieces and the moldings in each of the rooms. So this is the furniture set. We can see Elizabeth in the parlor furniture suite, in the paintings hung throughout the house that she completed in her youth, and in the bold choice of wallpaper and gilding detail. These are pot holders that have been embroidered by Elizabeth with her anagram. However, of Alapetsa, there is nothing. Only census information taken in 1881 and 1891, which tells us that she and her children by Cornelius lived just a few kilometers away, away from the ranch at head of the lake. She did get married to a man from her community, and together they had more children. The O'Keefe house, its decor and its furnishings affirms and gives evidence of the tastes and peculiarities of the women who lived there and at times struggled in the face of geographic isolation, economic hardship, and sociocultural uncertainty. But while the house affirms and legitimates the lives and bodies of some through materials and artifacts, it is also marked by the bodies and lives of those displaced and erased. It is important to note that when Mary Ann O'Keefe came to the ranch, she brought the number of white women in the valley up to 3. While conducting my research in the archives at O'Keefe Ranch this past winter, when I failed to come across anything in the files, I asked Ken, the archivist, did Mary Ann know about Alapetsa? He told me a story, making it clear that we have no way of knowing how true it is, that by the time Mary Ann had arrived at the ranch, Alapetsa had been asked to leave and had moved back home. And one day, Mary Ann, while working in the store, had a small indigenous boy come in and sort of just take a bag of potatoes and leave. She followed him out and said, "You're gonna have to pay for that." And he replied, "Just stick it on my dad's tab." So when I walked through the house and imagined what it may have been like over 100 years before, I wondered about the desires and dreams, the tensions and anxieties of a young wife with so much responsibility. Responsibility to her husband, but also responsibility to establish an example of correct deportment and conduct, so heavily entrenched at the time with colonialist ideals and values. As Anne McClintock suggests, white women were not, quote, the hapless onlookers of empire, but ambiguously complicit both as colonizers and colonized, privileged and restricted, acted upon and acting, end quote. I should note that there exists a wealth of scholarship that examines domestic ordering and arrangement, as well as the importance of the family in the context of the colonial project in Canada. This scholarship has influenced my thinking and interpretation of the house and its objects, as well as the histories of the O'Keefe women and how their stories and legacies continue to impact the social construction of space and local narratives and imaginings of 19th century settler colonialism. Furthermore, innovative and downright creative sociological scholarship, as well as thoughtful feminist art historical musings on fiction and narrative, have emboldened me to tell a story instead of giving a conventional paper. So I'll end it here now without much ceremony. In so many ways, the story is not over, but I thank you very much for listening.